Okay, well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. My name is Michelle Scott. I'm one of the members of the Boston Region MPO staff, and I want to welcome you all to this meeting of the MPO's Pilot Transit Working Group. Before we get rolling into the agenda items for the meeting, I want to give our Executive Director, Takeaw, an opportunity to give you all a welcome. So I'll turn things over to her.
Michelle. So I will just echo the welcome to our second Pilot Transit Working Group meeting. We, the Boston Region MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, are hosting this meeting. Our goal in working with you is to help facilitate coordination between the various transit providers in our region. Michelle may talk more about this. Excuse me, I'll move my cat. Our last one was in January, and we hope to actually have these more often. Probably no surprise to many of you, we had some interruptions and some things that sort of factored into waiting, around 7 months to have our second one. But welcome. As Michelle said, I am Tegan Tyke. I'm the Executive Director of Central Transportation Planning staff to the Boston Region MPO. As staff, we have two primary roles. One is that support of the Boston Region MPO, and we work with them to help them realize, to help the board realize their vision to create a modern, well-maintained transportation system in the region in a way that is transparent and also inclusive. And then we also play a role with our transportation planning expertise on staff. We carry out a wide range of technical and planning studies to support our partners, including folks like MassDOT, the MBTA, municipalities, and others. So we have sort of two sides to our organization that are very related. If you're not familiar, the Boston Region MPO is 97 cities and towns, so it is quite diverse. I hope that everybody on this call knows that transit providers in our region are particularly fundamental in ensuring that our essential workers can get to their jobs, that there is equitable and accessible access to opportunities for all of the residents in the region and those who work in the region. And in particular, many of these transit providers pay close attention to serving vulnerable populations, such as the elderly or people with disabilities, and people who have barriers to their mobility. So many of you are here with us today as participants. Sorry if my computer is kind of going off. We have quite a few different kinds of transit service providers in our region. This includes the MBTA, of course, and other regional transit authorities providing fixed route and flexible service. We have roughly 10 transportation management associations or TMAs in the Boston region, and many of those provide transportation services. And then we have, of course, a number of municipalities and councils on aging and nonprofits that provide various transportation services, many of which focus on those vulnerable populations. So many of you are represented on the RSVP list for this event, and we really appreciate your time. So when we reached out to you all, to transit providers, and setting up this pilot working group to understand what you hoped to get out of it, one thing you called out is a desire to increase your ability to coordinate your operations and your planning work with other service providers, and in particular with the MBTA. So I'm excited to say that today we have two excellent MBTA employees, as well as some support staff of theirs, Kat Banesh, who's the Chief of Operations Strategy, Policy, and Oversight, and Laurel Paget-Seekins, who is the Assistant General Manager for Policy, and they will both be talking about short-term and medium-term service planning and policy changes or consistencies in the MBTA's response to COVID-19. So I am very grateful to have them here, and I am very grateful to have all of you here to engage in this conversation together, and I look forward to having a robust conversation and hopefully identifying additional opportunities for coordination in the future. So with that, Michelle, I will pass it back to you. Michelle Scott is one of our Chief Transportation Planners that supports the Boston Region MPO, and she will be the main facilitator for the rest of this meeting. Michelle?
Thank you, Taken. So to get started, I'll just mention quickly a few other details about the Pilot Transit Working Group, do a quick run through of other parts of today's agenda, and mention some meeting guidelines. So just to add a little bit of detail about the Transit Working Group, as Tegan mentioned, this is our second meeting of this group after a long hiatus. As mentioned in the title, it is a pilot. We're trying out this initiative this year and potentially a little bit into the next calendar year to see how this group can help potentially improve coordination among transit providers in the Boston region, and to help the MPO bring more transit information and expertise into the work that it does in making decisions about transportation funding and opportunities for transportation technical assistance and analysis. As Taken mentioned, we've been asking entities such as regional transit authorities, transportation management associations, municipalities to operate transit service, to participate this group, and we're trying to widen to our umbrella to councils on aging and state transportation agencies that work in the transit space to participate in these meetings. And of course, advocacy groups and members of the public are always welcome as well. We kind of want to create a big tent to help tackle some of these issues. And we appreciate you all for being here today, whether you attended our previous meeting or if this is your first time. So during this pilot, we're hoping we can learn more about how to structure this group to meet those goals that I mentioned, and both support the work the region's transit providers are doing, as well as to foster stronger connections between these providers and the MPO. If you want to read a little more about about this group, you can check out the Pilot Transit Working Group page that's available on the MPO website. Okay. Matt, if you could bring up the agenda slide real quick, thank you. So we've covered the welcome, moving through the meeting guidelines now. Next, we will segue into the main topic of our discussion today, which is talking and hearing from MBTA representatives about the MBTA service changes and some of the work they're doing to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Following that, we'll hear a little bit from other members of MPO staff about other transit-related activities that are going on at the MPO in terms of technical assistance, studies that are happening, things that the MPO is doing through its capital investment programs and things of that nature. Towards the end of the meeting, we'll have an opportunity for transit providers to bring up any updates or information they want to share with the larger group. Other attendees are welcome to make additional comments in the public comments section if we don't get to them as part of the other agenda items. And finally, we'll close out with some next steps for the meeting that's happening today. Now to go over some meeting guidelines. Matt, if you could bring that slide up, please. I have a number of MPO staff that are helping me with this meeting today. Tegan has, of course, given a great welcome. My colleagues Kate White, Matt Archer, and Sandy Johnston will be helping me this afternoon. They'll have MPO staff referenced in their name that appears on their video window for Zoom. So in general, we ask that you could bear with us through any technical difficulties. The MPO has been hosting virtual meetings roughly during the beginning of closures during the pandemic, but this is our first time hosting a meeting of the Pilot Transit Working Group over Zoom, and this is already a pretty new group for the MPO to begin with, so we hope you'll kind of bear with us as we address any difficulties during the meeting. So we brought up a slide that highlights the general meeting guidelines. First, you may have noticed that you joined this meeting on mute. The meeting host will mute or unmute participants as needed. We ask that you do not mute yourself. If you do, the host will later need to request your permission to unmute you. A little Zoom notification box will pop up in Zoom for that. And while that's not the end of the world, of course, it does take a little bit of time to reestablish the audio. So if you could not mute yourself, that would be great. If you haven't done so already, please rename your Zoom window if you can with your first and last name, a comma, and then your affiliation. This information helps us as MPO staff get familiar with who is in the room and helps us to identify transit providers for whom this particular meeting is focused. For this meeting, we're encouraging attendees to submit questions or comments through the chat function in Zoom. And you should be able to access that at the bottom of your screen. The chats will go to the hosts. We're not set on chat everyone, so your questions and comments will go to the host, who will queue up questions for our presenters, and relay comments, and generally manage the flow of discussion that way so that we can use the time during the meeting effectively. There will be an option to raise your hand if you prefer to do that, but we will be prioritizing questions and comments that come in through the chat. If you do need or would like to raise your hand, you can do so by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, which will bring up a list of participants, and then you should be able to raise your hand through the series of options that appear at the bottom of the screen. And then the host will be able to call on you. If you're participating over the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. If you run into any difficulties during the meeting, you can send a message through the chat, which will go to the hosts, and a member of MPO staff will connect with you. You can also reach Matt Archer, who will be providing technical support today, at either through the chat box by contacting Matt, M-A-R-C-H-E-R at ctps.org, or by calling 857-702-3708. Just some additional items. Kate and Sandy will be taking some notes during this meeting. We can share this audio with you after the meeting. Share the notes with you after the meeting. Although we will be able to share the audio as well, because this Zoom meeting is being recorded, as is the general practice with meetings hosted by the Boston Region MPO. And we will upload this video to the Boston Region MPO YouTube page following the meeting. So having gone through those general items, we can move into our main item for today, which is that discussion with representatives of the MBTA about their service planning and other strategies that they are following to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The purposes of the discussion are twofold. First, to support coordination between the MBTA and other Boston Region transit providers as they continue to provide service during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and to support relationship building and general communication between the MBTA and other Boston Region transit providers. As Tegan may have referenced at some of our earlier transit working group discussions, a number of transit providers mentioned an interest in coordinating with the T on service provision and related issues. So we really appreciate these representatives from the MBTA to be here to support this type of discussion. Before we get further into that part of the meeting, I just want to highlight a few other things. The speakers will be delivering a short presentation. After they present, you can chat any questions or comments using the Zoom chat function. After those presentations are finished, MPO staff will read out clarifying questions and then broader questions and comments in order to get this broader discussion started. This forum is intended to focus on the experiences of transit providers. And so we're going to be prioritizing questions and comments that come from transit providers, although we will try to give everyone in attendance an opportunity to share information in the time we have allotted for the meeting. We can appreciate that there may be coordination issues and items of mutual interest between the MBTA and other Boston Region transit providers that range from the high level to the very specific. And our intent for this conversation is to flag issues and opportunities that the MBTA and other providers can address in more detail after the meeting, particularly if they are specific to individual services or routes or particular circumstances. So limiting the length of those detailed discussions during this meeting will help us maximize the limited time we have available. And as I mentioned, MPO staff will be able to share notes that we've taken after the meeting, and those can hopefully support any follow-up conversations that need to happen. In planning for today's discussion, we asked our speakers to consider sharing information about things like the factors shaping MBTA service planning and decision-making, the best ways for transit providers to give input on service plans and things like that, and the types of information that they might like from you to help support ongoing coordination. And we're also asking for you all in attendance to think about similar questions on your end, the types of information that you would like from the MBTA to help service planning going forward, what information you'd like Kat and Laurel to share back with their colleagues at the MBTA, and general constraints and issues and adaptations that you're facing in your service as you continue to deal with the ongoing pandemic and the effects it's having on transit service in the region. Finally, I know that a number of attendees here attended the Essential Trips Forum that the MPO and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council hosted back in May, and you can find the recording from that event on the MPO's YouTube page as well. But that discussion was really productive in helping the participants share a common understanding of all the complex issues that transit providers are facing through the pandemic. And everyone was really eager to learn from each other and move towards solutions. And I'm hoping that kind of energy will be there in our discussion today as well. So before I turn things over to our speakers, I just want to quickly introduce them. First, we have Kat Banesh, who is the Chief of Operations Strategy, Policy, and Oversight. In that capacity, she oversees the Service Planning and Scheduling Department, the Transit Priority Team, as well as multiple continuous improvement initiatives, including the MBTA's Lean Six Sigma team. Laurel Paget-Seekins is the Assistant General Manager for Policy. She has worked at the MBTA for 6 years in the intersection of data, policy, and community engagement. Her team works on policy for fares and service, and she's coordinating a cross-agency working group for COVID transition. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kat and Laurel to start the main discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, and thank you, Tegan, for creating the space to have us here. And I already followed your first rule, which is don't mute yourself after being unmuted. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As Michelle said, I think Laurel and I would love to give sort of a 20-minute presentation just to ground the conversation, and then happy to engage the conversation from there. But in preparing for this, we thought it would be really helpful before we dove into the questions of coordination to ground ourselves in, from the T's perspective, where we were back in February and March, where we are today, and where we're thinking about going. Since there's, I'm sure with all the transit providers, been a lot of hard thinking and a lot of soul searching over the past few months. I also want to say two things before we dove into this. The first is that, and I'm sure this is incredibly obvious, but even though Laurel and I are speaking to everyone today, the recognition that there are dozens of hardworking individuals at the MBTA, both employees and contractors, who are behind all the work to what you're seeing today between our bus operators, our scheduling team, our customer tech team. And so please recognize that we will be presenting a lot of it, but really it's many of the individuals, some of which who are on this call right now, who did all the hard work. And that too, I'm sure there'll be questions that come up that we cannot answer, but we will do our very best to follow up afterwards to get the answers that do come up. So with that, Matt, if you're kind enough to, or actually before, Laura, anything you wanted to add before we jump in?
No, that's great. Thanks, Kat.
So like I said, we'll try to keep this short because I think it's really the discussion is probably the most valuable part for everyone. But first and foremost, I think it's always helpful because we're now, it's July. It's terrifying to say that we're in July, and trying to think, where were we all back in, say, March? And really February. And so what you see here is on the far right, and we'll start on the right and then we'll talk about the left, is essentially what was going on with ridership. And I'll show you sort of later in about 2 slides how ridership has begun to recover. But right here on the right-hand side, even starting in early March, ridership began dropping pretty precipitously across all our modes. And what you have there on the x-axis is every single week going forward, all the weekdays, and on the y-axis indexed to 100% of ridership, with the baseline being mid-February. And you can see ridership dropped pretty significantly just around the time as March 10th, the state of emergency was declared. March 17th, we all remember restaurants and bars were closed. Gatherings were limited to fewer than 25 people. And on the 24th of March is when non-essential businesses were closed. But even before that, ridership had essentially done most of its drop off. And I imagine many of you saw very similar things, as this was predominantly driven a lot by commuters and all traveling populations. And you'll see here, I think what's noticeable though is that each mode dropped at different rates. And so the colors coordinate to the line, if it is a heavy rail or light rail. The dotted line represents the ride, our paratransit service, and the yellow represents the bus. And so I call this out just to remember, and I think this is an incredibly visual representation of the amount of uncertainty we are all facing. So jumping then to the left-hand side with the bullets is just, when we think back to where we were in early March, everyone, including ourselves and around the nation and the world even, were facing decreased ridership. Accompanying with that, we were all experiencing lower workforce availability as our workforce was staying home either because they were sick, they were taking care of their children, they were in a caretaking duty. So our workforce attendance was down, and understandably so. And overall, I think we were all facing incredible increased uncertainty about what is coming next. Where's this going? How long are we going to be in this? What even are the best precautions to take to deal with this virus? So the very first thing, one of the first things we did in early March is roughly that first week of March, is saying, well, how do we respond? What do we need to do? We got a group together and said, no matter what are our service principles? No matter what happens next, what are those principles we're going to use to rely on to get us through this crisis? Many of you might be familiar, we have a service delivery policy back from 2017 that dictates the level of frequency, span of service, coverage that we want to achieve on all of our modes. And on top of that, we wanted to say, during this crisis, what else do we want to think about? And I think it's important to go through this because we continue to really rely on these principles going forward. I think first and foremost is the fact that we decided that no matter what, it was essential that the MBTA continue to provide critical services to those who rely on the MBTA for essential trips. So we thought about the fact that we are essentially a utility, we provide a public good. No matter what, we need to provide some level of service throughout the crisis. Secondly, is with our increased uncertainty and our lower workforce attendance, we knew we needed to be flexible, but we also wanted to be predictable and reliable, particularly for our bus riders. We know a lot of them depend on coming to a bus stop and being able to know what time their bus is coming and how long will that bus take them to where they go, especially our essential workers. So when we designed our service, we figured out, we try to find that balance between how do we provide flexibility so we can handle whatever happens with our workforce, whatever happens with our ridership, but also make sure that we have schedules, we're reliable, and that we weren't going to change from week to week, but we changed our schedules essentially once in March and basically held that for 2 to 3 months, which I think we're very proud of, and because it provided a very reliable outcome for those essential workers. 3, absolutely incredibly important that we support physical distancing for both our employees and our customers where possible. And 4, in all of our messaging, encouraging essential travel only and really trying to preserve that capacity for those who had to take trips. And so what that led to, and it's on the slide, but you might remember, when we made the decision on March 17th to reduce service, we went to a modified Saturday schedule on both bus and rail. And what that did, and this goes back to that selling point, is we essentially then ran a Saturday schedule with some modifications. But everyone who could still come to work came to work, who was supposed to come into work. And you can imagine that basically created this incredibly valuable, flexible capacity for us so that we were always able to provide that Saturday level of service. And where we had additional people who came in, they drove extra buses, they worked platforms, they drove trains to ensure that we were able to provide actually above that service. But at the very least, we had a minimum that we were able to meet. And we've taken that philosophy with us forward. When we look back at everything we've learned over the past few months, I think things that we realize now that were probably very evident to us, everyone now, is when we look at our ridership changes, we have seen incredibly non-uniform ridership changes. So on the right-hand side there, you can see that bus ridership didn't drop off nearly as much as, say, our heavy rail or commuter rail. But then even when you look in by route, there's lots of variations. So you can imagine the SL2, which runs to the seaport, probably 10–15% of baseline ridership versus something like the 111 or the 22 maybe 30 to 35% of baseline ridership during the height of the crisis, say back in April, when we saw, I think, the lowest ridership. We've also learned the incredible value over the past few months of having essentially real-time data. A number of our teams were able to essentially find ways to process our automated passenger counter, which is our passenger data off our buses. So we could see within 24 hours, where did we have riders, where did we have crowding, and allow us to respond real time, since the ridership wasn't dropping off uniformly, and we have this flexible capacity. We were able to rely essentially within a 1-day lag based on customer complaints, tweets, outreach by advocates, and even our own operators where they were seeing crowding, so we could try to utilize that extra capacity as effectively as possible. And then that relates to the last bullet point. I think we've all realized that the definition of crowding has changed. Our service delivery policy from 2017 defines crowding on a bus or train significantly more than I'd say we would feel safe right now, and feel that is an appropriate level of people on a vehicle. So that fundamentally changes our definition of capacity. So I think as we think about where we're going from here, I think it was really helpful just to talk through this, because I think it's important to remember back in March just how much uncertainty we all had. And I think we were all trying to make the best decisions possible with the information we had. And I think we've learned a lot from that. And I realize that many people in our community have been very helpful in providing input and suggestions for how to better respond. And we try to take that into account as best as possible. So changes on the bus, we added service on the blue line shortly after we reduced service. We added service on the green line, on the E line, to better serve Longwood Medical shortly after we reduced service. So even though we still say a modified Saturday schedule during this period, we were being very dynamic in the background, shifting service based on request and demand. Matt, could you go to the next slide, please? And so where are we going now, and sort of where we are? And I think, again, picture's worth 1,000 words. So this slide shows, again, it's that same slide you saw on the previous one, but now drawn up for a few weeks. So again, on the x-axis is every week since essentially the end of February. On the y-axis is, again, ridership indexed to that baseline week of February 24th. And you can see ridership dropped off, pretty much stayed there through April. And ever since about end of April has been slowly coming back on all modes. So I think we are now, not surprisingly, bus and the ride have been coming back quicker, as has the blue line, while our heavy rail and light rail, other than the blue line, have been coming back a little slower. We're probably now at about 40% of baseline ridership for bus, and the blue line's probably around 35%. And we've been basically seeing 5% increase week over week on all the modes, which I think I think it's been very interesting to see. It's a very constant trend. It's a very predictable trend. It's just a slow increase. And I think the big question is to see how this holds out for the rest of the summer and the fall. So when we were thinking about the next big service change we made, which was in June 21st, as you may recall, June 22nd, this was essentially the data we were looking at to say, where is the ridership returning? Where are we seeing what we call this more durable ridership, where riders were still using transit even throughout the non-essential businesses being closed. And I think it's been fascinating to see, I didn't go into much here, but time of day has changed. Our peaks no longer look quite the same. Everything I think we really knew about ridership has really changed in this pandemic, and it's paused us, made it into what we then changed for the summer. A lot of thinking went through, and a lot of sort of nuanced changes to better reflect that. If you want to go to the next slide, Matt. So essentially then what we did on June 21st was the intent to, as our workforce is coming back and as ridership is coming back, is to add service throughout the entire system where we could, but really adjusting based on ridership. So on heavy rail and light rail, we're now operating 100% of normal weekday service. Of course, depending on workforce ability, some days we make it, some days we may not, but that's really our intent. But again, very closely watching that ridership and seeing if we need to adjust, again, capacity to better match time of day, because we have really found the peak has moved earlier in the day, as well as in the afternoon peak also earlier in the day. On the bus and Silver Line side, I think, and this is a nuance is I think really important to call out. On the bus and Silver Line side, we also have returned technically to 100% of normal weekday service. But again, going back to the idea of how important it's been to really have that flexible, unscheduled work, we're essentially taking our 100% of normal weekday service hours and concentrating it on 80% of our routes. So we're running all of our buses, all of our operators are coming in to work a normal shift, but we're running it on a smaller section of routes, about 80% of our routes. And that basically allows us, by doing that, we essentially have had greater flexibility. So 70% of all our service is scheduled, and we have about 30% of our service being flexible or on schedule. And again, what that means, if you are an individual taking a bus, or you had a community member taking a bus, they would go to the, let's pick on say like the 88, right? You're going to wait for the 88 over by Leechmere. You know your bus is supposed to come at 7 o'clock. Our intent is to make sure that bus comes at 7 o'clock. But if we had seen repeated crowding on the 88, where possible with capacity, we will now try to run another 88 around the same time to ensure that we have that additional capacity. So again, very much trying to meet that minimum that we said we're going to make, and then trying to exceed that with that flexible capacity. And again, we found that to be very effective to both manage demand, manage sort of all these operational needs and changes from week to week, while still providing a reliable set of service. And then we've also added service to some routes with durable ridership. So there are a few routes out there, we'll say the 111, the 116, the 117, the 22, the 28, where had some of the highest levels of durable ridership during the height of the crisis, where we've actually now tried to add service to be either equivalent to a regular weekday pre-COVID, or even above regular weekday service pre-COVID. On the commuter rail and ferry side, again, on the commuter rail side, we've brought back about 85% of regular service, though the peak patterns follows what they were pre-COVID. With the exception of the Fairmont line, we've actually brought back all the service plus 8 additional trips as part of the Fairmont line pilot. On the ferry wasn't running for the past 3 months. We've actually restarted the ferry, running about 75% of service operations, service hours, and resuming service to Hingham Hole and Charlestown. And the ride throughout the entire pandemic has operated at regular service, with some operational changes in terms of how they handle the call center. So that's where we are right now. So I think taking a step back, essentially what we've said is, so we still value that flexibility, we still value that reliability. We have a higher workforce availability, so we now want to come back pretty close to 100% of service across the system, with the exception of bus, where we have operating 100% of service, but concentrating on our 80% of our routes. When we look ahead to this fall, and this is what Laurel's going to talk about as well, we're recognizing we're still in the situation where ridership has not come back to what it was pre-COVID, and where it has come back, it has definitely been varied across routes, varied across modes. So the process that the team is going through right now is saying, can we rebalance service accordingly? If we know we have ridership resuming to say 50 or 60% of baseline on the 111, but say only 10 or 15% on the SL2, can we rebalance our service hours to better match where we're seeing demand? So we're still providing coverage, we're still providing scheduled reliable service, but we have to recognize the fact that where we're seeing demand isn't the same as it would be pre-COVID, and it's driven by who is teleworking, who still is going to work, who doesn't have access to a car, chooses not to have access to a car. So trying to be as flexible to that as possible and respond to that as possible, and knowing that I think we're all kind of in uncharted waters here. And then we're also thinking very hard about how do we think about the network, this is why I'm thrilled we're talking about the transit providers, is as system-wide and sort of multimodal decisions, right? How do we think about passengers shifting between ride and bus? How do we think about them shifting by time of day? How do we thinking across modes and the RTAs? Which, when we think about how we're going to manage service going forward, it really is a combination of both supply and demand. So I'll hand over to Laurel now, if you want to go to the next slide, Matt.
Thanks, Kat. So as Kat mentioned, as our supply was constrained, especially because we saw, increased or continued ridership on bus, but a significant drop off on the commuter rail, we started thinking about, like, how do we shift riders between modes if we have capacity? And so one of the things we did is to create a pilot that started July 1 of having the Lynn commuter rail station in Zone 1A to see if bus and commuter rail riders, bus and blue line riders, so the buses that feed into the end of the blue line could switch to using commuter rail if they're taking trips all the way into Boston. And so that was paired with it also some when in the schedules that started on June 22nd, we added back more of the off-peak service to Lynn to try to fill some of those gaps, so that knowing that the bus riders aren't always riding at the time, so commuter rail riders are adding some off-peak service. So there was both a service and a fares conversation about how could we possibly serve some of those bus riders, knowing that that's some of the places where we have crowded buses are on the routes that are serving the communities around Lynn and coming into Wonderland. Then we also made the youth pass valid on all commuter rail zones. So if young people have a youth pass, they could use it on the commuter rail instead of bus. And we started the Fairmont line pilot. So the pilot was scheduled to start already and was pushed back until we implemented the new commuter rail schedules, but we started it as planned with those 8 additional trips, hoping to serve those bus riders along the Fairmont line with the additional Fairmont line service. And additionally, as part of the Fairmont line pilot, we installed fare validators, so riders in that section of the Fairmont line Zone 1A stations can use their Charlie card as well. So we're tracking to see how that is working to increase transfers from bus to commuter rail. So that was kind of part of our thinking and our strategy. We're still thinking about this moving forward. Where are we where do we have parallel service between the commuter rail and bus, and where are there possible places where people could shift, knowing that it's not the solution for everyone. But that is one of the things we're thinking about even as we think about the fall and the fall commuter rail schedules. Secondly, we knew we wanted to provide more information. So some passengers can change their trips, whether it's to a different vehicle or a different time of day. And so we've launched, and this really is a huge shout out to our customer technology team, real-time crowding data on some of our busiest bus routes. We're still adding to that as we get the data verified. So this is coming off our automatic passenger counters and more or less real-time being able to share that data to our passengers through our website, the third-party apps like the transit app, and then also on the e-ink signs that we have out at some of our busy bus stops. And so that we know only serves some of the needs of our customers. We did some surveying, figuring how information would be needed. And so we're also working on how we could share like recent historical crowding data for our heavy rail lines. We don't have real-time data, but we do know sort of historically over the last week when people have been tapping into stations, so that we can try to give people a sense, given that we know that the increase has been fairly linear, that today is going to look pretty similar to the last 3 days or 4 days, that we can tell folks when we've seen sort of higher ridership on those lines, so people can plan their trips, because we know that it's also different riding the subway than bus. You actually have to kind of commit to going into the station, tapping your Charlie card before you know exactly how many people are on that vehicle. So we're working on that. Hopefully later this summer, we'll be able to start rolling that out on our website as well. And finally, we've been thinking through and working with employers about how to manage demand. So we launched a new fare product on July 1 on the commuter rail called the 5-day Flex Pass. So anticipating that some work schedules would change, whether that's to every other day, every other week, that employees wouldn't necessarily need a full monthly pass on the commuter rail. And so we created a new fare product that's available on the M-Ticket app for people who still be able to get a discount for buying in bulk. And essentially what it gives is it gives you 5 days. You can use it for 5 days within 30 at a discount. So you can buy basically 5 one-day passes, and that can be, if you use it up between 30 days, that's fine, you can buy another one. So trying to be as flexible as possible. And then we also started an employer panel survey to try to get information from employers on sort of what they're thinking in terms of work schedules, so that we could sort of better understand, not just for service, but also for these fair decisions about how to serve needs. And so I can share the sign up for that survey with the MPO staff, and they can send it out. Definitely looking for folks to help us get the word out to employers that we're looking for them to join that, so they can sort of give us some input on some of the ideas we're having about possible changes we could make and whether that would serve their needs. So that's super high level, some of the thinking we're doing about how to manage the demand side of the equation. Obviously, there's sort of some iteration with service and demand to sort of see how these efforts are working. But that's continues to be kind of how we're thinking about moving into the fall, and then how we start thinking about next year. I think that is our last slide.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Kat and Laurel, for that great overview of the types of planning and responding to changes that the MBTA has been doing. I want to encourage attendees to submit questions and comments via the chat that we can present and relay into the discussion here, and so that the T representatives can respond to. I'm going to ask my colleague, Kate White, to let me know if there are any questions that have come in already that we can get started with, and with a focus on clarifying questions first, if possible.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, we had a couple questions come in already, and just to remind people, just send them in the chat. We'll be happy to include them. So first clarifying question is, you described 100% of service on 80% of the routes. Does that mean 0% of service on 20% of routes? And can you share the name of these routes that currently have no service and describe what to expect in the fall for these 20% of routes?
Great question. So I will clarify that. Yes and no. So that yes does mean there are about 20% of our routes that do not technically have any service operating of them. I will caveat two things with that though. First is the vast majority of those routes, with the exception of 5, have been not operating since March 17th. We actually got a request recently to better clarify which routes those are on the website, and I believe that should actually be going up in the next day or two. Again, big shout out to customer technology for that. The one exception are when we made the summer service changes, there were 5 routes we chose to suspend. There were 2 routes we brought back, the 19 and the 245, because they were serving medical communities, and there are 5 routes we chose to suspend based on very low ridership, and their fact they were they're largely express routes, predominantly targeting commuters charging that 9 to 5. So we made the decision those resources would be better spent for the overall Commonwealth on other routes. That being said, I don't want to be misleading to say that there are 20% of corridors or streets that we typically operate on where there is no service. We did go through a lengthy exercise to make sure that the vast majority of riders who would have taken one of those routes do have alternatives. So for example, if you're a rider on the 325 in Medford, and I might get the 325, 326 swapped, you still have bus routes that are operating on your streets like the 100 and the 101 that may take you to the Orange Line. So the routes themselves may not be operating, but there are very few instances, though there are some, where anyone should be technically quote unquote stranded. So they're more than a quarter of a mile or 3/4 of a mile from, from MBTA transportation. So that's, yes, the routes are not operating. Yes, they should be on the websites. We can follow up with the list afterwards if it would be helpful. But there's still predominantly service still available on all those corridors. And as planned for the fall, that is something we're actively working on right now. Our current belief is that the majority of those routes will come back, but we're currently in the process of just beginning to start that community engagement process, and probably have more to share more officially in about 2 weeks.
Awesome, thank you very much. Another question we had come up was, what are some of the capacity limits or policies when you exceed all available capacity? So such as base service plus flex service based on new crowded definitions.
Can you repeat that once more?
Of course. What are some of the capacity limits or policies you undertake when you exceed all available capacity. So this is the base service plus flex service based on new CRADA definitions.
So I think this, oh, go ahead, Laurel.
Oh yeah, no, you can start and I'll
I think this
tag
gets the
on.
heart of why we think about supply and demand so importantly. Like and I think every public transportation organization out there who had high ridership, I think before COVID-19 is in the same camp of, if ridership comes back all the way, if ridership comes back to what it was pre-COVID, yet our definition of crowding has decreased, there is a point where naturally we do not have enough capacity. And I think this is a question that every public transit agency in the US is currently working through. I think this is why Laurel and I are thinking, and really the whole organization is thinking so deeply about how do you manage both your supply and your demand and shifting based on modes, right? How can we get potential riders onto commuter rail where we might have capacity? How can we shift people to times of day where we might have more capacity? And so I think and how can we work with organizations to encourage their workers to either telecommute or to travel during off times? And so I think there's lots of different mechanisms and probably not one perfect solution. I don't know what Laura else you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that really factored into our conversations around sort of how we set and where we set kind of the new threshold for defining crowding was really about sort of how we plan service, right? So it was less about like in the moment what to do when there's, you know, one additional person on a bus, because that's a really sort of really difficult decision, but more thinking about through the what is our planning threshold, so that when service planning is sort of making the new schedules or we're trying to allocate the flexible service that Kat was talking about, like what is the sort of threshold we're using to sort of move a bus from here to there. And we knew that needed to be a threshold that was high enough such that we felt like it would justify that decision of saying, we're going to take a bus that was serving this route that has lower ridership and move it to a bus in our planning to a bus route that has very high consistent ridership. And so we went through a whole process of thinking through what that number should be for our bus fleet, so that we could to think about how to allocate the resources, which is a slightly different question than the like, what do you do in the moment if there's, you know, X number of people on a bus. And so one other piece of this is sort of thinking through like the policy around sort of drivers being able to bypass stops. At what condition can drivers bypass stops if there's too much crowding on their bus, such that it's sort of infringing upon the space that is allocated to them to keep the distance from the driver. And so that was the other piece where we're sort of thinking about the like more of the real-time decision making sure that we put some procedures in place such that there was connection back to our operating center, and also to make sure that we have a long-standing policy that if a bus is too crowded, even pre-COVID, to pick up a passenger with a visible disability or in a wheeled mobility device, that we would still stop the bus to explain to that passenger why they were being stopped, why they're being bypassed, why they didn't fit. And so we're still continuing that policy to make sure that we're serving the needs of our passengers with disabilities through this crisis, even if their buses are too crowded.
Thank you. So I'll keep continuing with any questions. If anyone has anything, please feel free to send it in the chat. So another question that we got is, you know, what can we communicate to our members, or some of the TMAs are asking, what can we communicate to our members about the steps the MBTA is taking to reduce the risk, to increase their confidence and allow their employees to take their subway and commuter rail?
Great question. And this is actually, Matt, if you want to go back to the deck, we had a hunch this might come up, and this is essentially out of Laurel's and my wheelhouse, but I think it is worth going through. So now this is, for everyone's knowledge, that's sort of the variation by some of our top 20 bus routes. Very interesting, but not the question. So there is, and happy to follow up with some additional links as well. the MBTA takes the safety of our employees and our riders incredibly seriously. And I think it is just ensuring that we had the right protocols, precautions, processes, and PPE in place has definitely caused sleepless nights for many people in the organization. So there's a variety of things going into effect. I can talk through them some at a high level, but I think probably the best thing is to connect you with sort of the wealth of resources that's available online, since I think this is something we've been trying to actively talk about since the start of the crisis. I think back in early March is when we sort of first put in our cleaning and decontamination protocols, and have essentially maintained or improved those since March. And just to talk through a high level, a few things. The first, what you see here is, and this is directly from our general manager's remarks from mid-June at our the monthly FMCB meeting. The first thing is we recently launched a new campaign called Ride Safer, which is a variety of external messaging really targeting our riders about the importance of wearing masks, the importance of practicing social distancing, some visual markers in place just to remind people to keep that 6-foot limit. And then things like you see here on the right side of trying to limit the number of parties in an elevator at the same time. You'll note here we say clearly party, recognizing some people might be traveling in small groups, but the idea is sort of one party at a time. So that should be, I think, on all elevators in the system, as well as you can see on the left-hand side, trying to provide messaging really in those sort of high volume locations. So that's sort of an ongoing rider campaign run by our customer experience campaign, customer experience team. You want to jump to the next slide, Matt? We're also doing a lot with our employees and have been doing this again since the early days of March, April. Face coverings are required for all of our employees anytime they're customer facing or can't socially distance or any shared spaces. We now have enough PPE for all of our employees and contractors. We are putting and have completed putting up enclosures around all of our bus operators and trolley operators that provides a much more durable barrier to provide better protection for airflow. We have temperature screening in most of our locations as well to ensure employees are temperature screened who are coming on site every day. We have COVID testing, free COVID testing available for all of our employees. And on the next slide, thank you, Matt. And this is where it gets, and there's tons of detail. And like Matt, I think the question is, we have a very, very lengthy and intense cleaning regime on both our stations and facilities and bus and rail vehicles. And it's to the level, and it's not here, but the point of like, we have process mapped out every time a vehicle is brought in by an operator and handed to a fueler who refuels it, who hands it to a bus mechanic. It is cleaned and sort of decontaminated at every single step of the way. So we're thinking about all those touch points. And I think trying to put a lot of messaging out there about how much we're trying to ensure that our vehicles are being kept as safe as possible. And I cannot speak to this as well, but I do know that the team that has been leading this, who has spoken to a number, I think, of sort of our national organizations and peers. I think Boston is actually probably one of the leaders in this area. So like I said, I will follow up after this with a bunch of the communications to help the TMAs get out there. But I think this is one area that I think the MBTA has actually done a really phenomenal job, and a full kudos to the team. And if there's any feedback or suggestions as well, happy to hear them. But I think there's a wealth of activity going on that is trying to keep our employees and our riders as safe as possible.
I believe there's some very nice videos as well of like the decontamination process, because we know we don't do it when customers see it. So we just want to make sure that we are putting out the information so people can see what is done. So there's some videos on our website as well of the process.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to group a couple questions we've gotten together on public outreach. You mentioned before that you're going to be working with different, you're doing public outreach on some of these service changes, but can you describe more about what kinds you will be doing and what will that look like with elected officials, other transit providers, and general public? And would you be going to any city council meetings or any other community meetings?
That's a great question. I think it's for the service changes coming this fall. I think I think the best way to think about them is sort of in a series of changes. So we have on the bus side particularly, that's where we want to start bringing back more of the routes this fall. Again, assuming that the Commonwealth continues to recover. We are as open as possible and trying to, I think, do as many touch points as feasibly possible, I think, in the next, let's say, 6 to 7 weeks. So they haven't been scheduled yet, but we are in the process of scheduling meetings with our advocates and community members, absolutely with our municipalities as much as possible. And elected briefings should be occurring shortly. I don't believe they've been scheduled yet, though, as well as targeting a public meeting or series of meetings in August. That being said, I think it's also fair to say, and I think important to say, we are, and I think it is just our summer, this is going to get a little technical, is the time between when our summer change goes into effect is, let's say, June, and then we change the schedules again, typically in August. So that timeline was incredibly compressed. So I don't think we're going to get nearly as much outreach in this go around than we'd like to. That being said, I think we all recognize that unless there's some vaccine coming very shortly, I think we all recognize that we are operating in living with COVID for the next few months, if not longer. And so very keen on doing outreach and engagement, not just for the fall service changes, but the winter and spring as well, since we have multiple chances to go back and change and modify based on feedback. So I think hopefully over the next 6 weeks, we'll be reaching out to many of the people who are interested, as well as asking for feedback, both from public and communities. But that being said, I do want to make sure very clear is even if there's a chance you miss a chance to give input in, let's say, for the fall changes, no, I think what is probably most helpful to hear is really when we think about winter and spring, where we have a lot more flexibility to incorporate changes, since I think we've all been trying to work as fast as possible in order to be as responsive as possible, if that makes sense.
Awesome, thank you. Question that we got was, are there any Title VI issues with choices made with the routes not run or any reductions in service?
Kat, do you want me to start on this one?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I guess the first thing, there's sort of procedural side, which is that FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, has given us, all transit agencies, some latitude, knowing that we are all operating in this crisis and making decisions much faster than we normally would. So there's been some direction from FTA on sort of how to proceed with changes without doing sort of the formal analyses, with the expectation that anything made permanently changed would need to go through a full analysis. I think that while we have that guidance, we have been very thoughtful and mindful of wanting to make sure that the changes that we make are equitable, and that not just that they would necessarily pass a Title VI analysis, but that like even broader definition of that, making sure that we're sort of prioritizing the needs of the communities that have been most impacted by the pandemic in how we're thinking about our service changes. And so it's been sort of one of the principles that, as Kat laid out at the beginning, we've been using to sort of inform our decision making. And I'm not sure, like we'll probably kind of do we're probably doing some informal analyses, even if it's not the full formal one, to sort of check our sort of assumptions here. But that when it gets to the point of where we have a little bit less uncertainty and more clarity as to what changes will be sort of longer lasting than others, I think we will do like a formal Title VI analysis of what those changes would be. Is that a fair assessment, Kat?
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I would add to that too, just to underline that we're currently doing a lot of these changes as temporary, is like we have not touched the ride service area map and the difference between premium and ADA fares either, which if any of these changes, and not to say that we would, but just to say is like, just to reinforce that these are currently viewed as temporary changes, and therefore we have not, so if they were more permanent changes, they would have those downstream impacts, and to say that currently we have not touched, and nor do we intend to change the ride transit service area.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I can ask another question, and then I think we want to do a quick time check and see where we're at. But you know, is there anything that you can share about some of the precautionary steps around social distancing and other health-related restrictions that anything to do with you know, ventilation and vehicle airflow? And will you also, and how does this change with some of the onboarding changes that we've that are now in place as of today?
So I will say that I am not an expert on our air HVAC systems in our buses or trains, so I cannot comment on that, though I know we do have teams who have been thinking about that, as well as working with manufacturers and the OEMs to consider how air flows through these vehicles.
I think the other part of the question, Kat, was just like, what are just the weeks in order to move back to front door boarding, which took effect today. We did install barriers for separation between the operators and passengers.
Correct. And that was a key element and stepping stone in order to be able to change or revert that policy.
Wonderful. So, so do you want to keep going with some more questions?
Well, what is that? It's your agenda, so I don't know if we're cutting into like other.
No,
items.
Definitely. We just wanted to make sure if there was any questions that you wanted to ask to the group while you're here. If not, we can keep going with questions for sure.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not sure what questions Laura might have. I think we have spent probably about 45 minutes in laying out sort of our philosophy and design choices and decisions. I would be curious to know if there were sort of any TMAs or RTAs on the call who made different choices and really why.
And if people need a moment to think of some of those, we can give you some time. But again, feel free to send us in the chat. And we're collecting all these questions so that they can be also put together, and we can put some of this information in a post-meeting email. So if we don't answer everything today, we'll definitely try and get some information for you all.
So I guess one of the other things that I've started thinking about that maybe we don't have any answers yet, but what I'm sort of anticipating we will need to answer is at what point and how do we unwind some of these policies? So I think we sort of have all kind of this like idea of a vaccine, an idea of sort of the pandemic subsiding, but that doesn't mean it's like a one-day change, right? Like at what point and what sort of public health data do we need in order to, you know, make these changes to the changes we've talked about? So like I've started sort of cataloging all of the policy changes that we've made and trying to figure out like what are the triggers for unwinding them and sort of moving back to particularly the sort of crowding threshold, because that obviously is the huge piece of our capacity. And so that's, I think, one thing we've just sort of started to think about is the like, what is it gonna take for us to be able to like sort of change some of these things, so that we have a clear understanding of like how long we have to maintain this system in terms of trying to increase the capacity, and what is the data we need to be looking for. So that I'm kind of, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but that's sort of my like forward thinking, trying to figure out like, you know, how long do we need to be planning for having this limited capacity system, which is really what's driving almost all of these changes, right? Is how do we facilitate transportation in a more physically distant manner, which is sort of counter to our concept of mass transportation.
Yeah, and that kind of ties with some of the other questions we've gotten about, you know, like you said, like when do we roll back some of these precautions? Some of the questions we've gotten is, what are some of the changes and pilots that you've done that you now kind of want to make more permanently, or like how does this affect? And you talked about data collection. You know, some have asked like, what are some of the ways that some of this data will now reshape how you do service planning in the future? So it's probably more of a comment, but slash a question, but just more of there's some of the things that some of the participants are asking too.
Well, I think it gets to this fundamental question that none of us know the answer to, right? Which is, how much have travel patterns changed not
Right.
maybe forever, but for the long term, right? Like even after the pandemic subsides, there might be some travel pattern changes that have changed long term. And I think that part of what we're wrestling with is, what is the world we want to live in, when the pandemic is ending, and how do we make the changes such that we're like arriving to that world at the end? And so both the question I think that was earlier about like, how do we make sure that people feel safe riding public transport is a really important piece of that, so that we're not sort of losing ridership even after the pandemic ends. But sort of even also some of this thinking about our network, thinking about sort of the pilots we're running, and thinking about sort of how to serve these trips, that there's sort of definitely some lessons learned to get to that, what is the world we want to live in when this is done question.
And
If I,
oh, sorry.
sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Oh no, I was going to kind of jump into a part 2 of that question, but Taken, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think I wanted to sort of add to the question, and maybe sort of part of the part 2 you were going to say. And again, hopefully some of you out there providing service are thinking about what you might want to express in response to Kat and Laurel's questions out to you guys, because one of the things we want to do is facilitate coordination and collaboration here. But related to what you were just saying, Laurel, so much of this conversation is around, as we all know, reaction. I mean, you have service that has to be operated and people that have to be served, and nobody knows quite what the future is going to look like. But in the perspective of the MPO and the way, we're always thinking about how do we shift. And when I say mode, I obviously mean we have talked about shifting from single occupancy vehicle trips onto transit and other sustainable modes of transportation. I know that you may think about operating service slightly differently, but do you still feel sort of empowered to think about boosting and enhancing transit in this climate environment, or is that sort of on hold? And if it is on hold, how do we sort of break out of that pattern and start to transition back to some of the things you're talking about, Laurel? Is like what world, what future do we want, and are we trying to work towards? And I realize it's a very vague question, and so if you don't feel like giving me specific answers, that's fine, but I do think that's the really important part of this conversation.
Well, I think just to sort of start a little bit of the conversation, obviously I think this is going to be something we're going to be talking about for months, if not years, is that essentially, right, we're in a world where there's like 3 crises piling on top of each other, or revealing themselves, right? So you have COVID, we have the sort of continued and focus on racial injustice in this country, and then we have an economic crisis, right? And so we have all of those things at the same time, and so I think we have to be thinking about sort of the future in the context of all 3 of those crises. And the economic crisis is obviously going to have an impact as well, both on our budget, but also on travel patterns. And so I think we're trying to figure out, like, through the lens of all 3 of those things, where we need to be and what decisions we need to make now to get ourselves there. I think one of the other things that's been super interesting in just looking at some of the data is where we're seeing like increased bike and walk trips, and like what is the sort of shift to bike and walk trips in this time, and sort of are people's concept of their neighborhood changing, and sort of what's in reach in a bike and walk trip. And so that's another thing that I think is sort of interesting to think about, sort of these connections, whether it's first and last mile to transit, or sort of what can be served within a bike walk trip. So that's another piece of we're sort of thinking holistically that I think is really important to be thinking about the future.
Yeah. And the one thing I could add to the question of like empowerment, is I think, and actually I'll give full credit to Matt Moran, who I think used this metaphor, is the idea of, I'm sure there's a better term for sort of the quality of the time, right? What does it mean for a minute or 2 stuck now in a transit or commute, right? And I think there, in some communications or dialogues we've seen externally, is sort of now this sort of elevation of how a single occupancy vehicle is safer. But I think inherently in that gets into those really difficult equitable conversations of why bus lanes and bus priority is still incredibly important, because 5 minutes on a car by yourself in traffic versus 5 minutes on a crowded bus with everyone else, of like, what does that time mean? And before we think about sort of the quality of waiting outside and bad weather, or sort of your experience, but I think now there's a whole public health lens to how long is your commute, if you are commuting, who is still commuting, who has the luxury of working from home. And I think it's in some ways even more important that we have these conversations than before.
So I just want to thank everyone for the questions. We're going to make sure to compile all those, and Kat and Laurel, thank you so much for answering them. So, if your question wasn't answered today, we'll work on getting you that information after the meeting.
And also, thank you for helping with that transition, Kate, and for all your hard work and Sandy's hard work and my colleagues' hard work managing the questions thus far. I'd like to transition briefly to the next item on the agenda, which relates to some of our MPO updates, but we do have some sections later in the meeting for transit provider exchange and public comment that we can, continue the discussion on some of the issues that we're, talking about here at this moment. And Kat and Laurel, if you're able to stay for a little bit longer in the meeting, that would be wonderful after we quickly cover some of the MPO items. So if that, works for everybody, maybe we can transition. But, just as a checkpoint, I really want to thank Kat and Laurel for being here and giving a great presentation that's provided a lot of valuable information and raised a lot of important questions about where transit providers in the region will really go from here in terms of responding to the pandemic.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I'd like to transition to the MPO updates items. We have several presenters from MPO staff with updates. We'll kind of follow a similar format in that we'll kind of run through the staff presentations in one group. And then we'll take questions about these items towards the end. Please continue to submit your questions through the chat as you have for this previous discussion item. So to get started, first is Paul Christner, who is the MPO staff's manager of transit analysis and planning, and he'll be speaking about a new COVID-19 technical assistance program for the region's transit providers and providing some study updates. And so I can turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Michelle. Matt, I think I had a slide if it's available to show for the COVID-19. There it is. Thank you very much. So some of you may have seen this in some of the materials that we send out already, but right now we're offering transit service planning assistance under our regional transit service planning technical support for COVID-19 service planning. So many of you may have reduced or suspended service, and as things change and different indicators come out, you may be thinking about relaunching service or increasing service. So we're looking for ideas from RTAs, TMAs, and councils on aging, municipalities, folks who run transit services that are open to the public, to apply and send project ideas to us by July 31st for ways that we can help you with that relaunch or increase of service. So we'll be reviewing those, and I have received some already from this, and I'm continuing to review them. And we'll get in touch with folks if any folks are on the meeting today who sent them in. So that is the quick background on that. One note is that we don't do any kind of public health stuff. I know there's a lot of concern about that, but we're leaving that to the public health experts. This is just focused on transit service planning. So a lot of the rules for that need to come from the public health experts. The other thing I was going to mention today was that we are working on a guidebook under our operating a successful community shuttle program. We're anticipating the guidebook to be ready in August. We've been interviewing local shuttle providers and looking at things like service design, performance measurement, branding and marketing, and funding. And the guidebook is intended for folks who are looking at launching a shuttle program and how to do that successfully. So those are my updates for today.
Thank you so much, Paul. And again, we'll take the other quick presentations, and then if folks can be submitting comments in the chat in the meantime, and then when we get through the end, we can take the questions as a group. So I'm actually going to turn it over briefly to Kate, who's been doing a great job throughout the meeting. And she's going to tell you a little bit about the upcoming outreach for the MPO's updates to its TIP project selection criteria. And this connects to transit in that over the past several years, the MPO has been working to expand its investment programs and strategies to address transit more directly where it's possible to do that. For example, you may be familiar with MPO's Community Connections program, which is working on addressing first and last mile issues. In our most recent long-range plan, we've also established a transit modernization program, and we can get into these in more detail at future meetings. But in any case, the criteria is a way that the MPO goes about evaluating the characteristics of projects and provides valuable information to MPO members into supporting project selection. And so, outreach is what's happening for this effort is a great way to, share your views about what you think about how projects are selected and how they can be improved. So I'll turn it over to Kate to give you a little bit more detail about upcoming things happening in that arena.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so you've been following some of our conversations around the TIP criteria. In the fall, we did some outreach around what were some of people's transportation priorities. This followed after the long-range transportation plan, and then we wanted to see what we had found in the LRTP, as well as to just make sure we were aligned with the region's transportation priorities. So we pulled all that together and looked at some peer other MPOs and what kind of criteria they use and best practices from state and federal agencies. And we put together a bunch of proposed changes to all the criteria that we use to evaluate our different projects. And so these projects include transit, it can complete streets, intersection improvements. And so what we're about to do is we've now presented all those changes to the MPO. But we want to hear from you and from members of the public all across the region about if these are the criteria changes that you want to see. And so we'll be releasing a survey that we'll make sure to send out to you all who attended today, as well as releasing a guidebook that kind of goes through what are some of these proposed revised changes. So you can really see what are the existing, what are some of the proposed changes, and then help us hear your input on some of those. So, and we would love for you to help us in some of that outreach because we want to get out to as many people as possible. We'll really be kind of concentrating that outreach from about next week, July 28th, to around later August. And then Matt Genova, our tech program manager, will be coming back to the MPO, presenting kind of final changes, and then the MPO will vote on new TIP criteria that will be used in the next round of the TIP, which is federal fiscal years 2022 to 2026, come this fall. And so again, we'd love your input. We'll make sure to send all that information out in the post-event email. But as well, please follow us on, I'll shamelessly plug our social media every time because you'll get all our up-to-dates, but at Boston Region MPO on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're also posting all of our virtual events on our YouTube channel, which again, we'll include in this event email afterwards. So if anyone has any questions about those, I'd be happy to ask them. But again, we'll be sending out that information afterwards.
All right, thank you, Kate. And just finally, I'd like to turn things over briefly to Sandy Johnston to give a quick update about our Community Connections program and progress that's been made in that area so far.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned a moment ago, the Community Connections program, or CC program, is the investment program where the MPO has set aside $2 million per year in the TIP, the broader capital investment program for first and last mile solutions. And over the past year, we've been running that program as a pilot, and we were pleased to make the first round of awards in the TIP that was just finalized. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the page we've put together about the program, and then a link to the list of projects that were funded through the pilot round. And the main thing for everyone to know at this point is to keep your eyes open for future funding opportunities through this program. We'll be launching another one probably in October or so. Between now and then, I'll be reporting back to the NPO on how the pilot round went, and we'll be putting out some public engagement materials so that we can tweak the program based on lessons from the pilot. And we'd certainly be interested in hearing from anyone who followed the pilot round or who just has something to comment on the program while we're doing that. And I'm always happy to field questions.
All right, thank you so much, Sandy. So we've kind of run through the material that we have through this section. I can talk for a few minutes to just give people a chance to submit anything through the chat that they would like. The next two portions of the meeting are more open-ended items intended. First, the transit provider exchange piece is designed to allow providers to give updates to one another, as I mentioned during the meeting or the outset of the meeting. And the general public comments is a space for other folks in attendance who may not be transit providers who would like to ask questions or raise issues and things of that nature. So we've covered a lot of material in the MBTA discussion, but I understand we still may have questions and comments that we haven't gotten to. So one thing we could do going forward is if transit providers in the audience don't have anything that they'd like to share through that update format, we could take that time to address some remaining questions from transit providers about the items raised by the MBTA, or an opportunity for them to share some of their experiences. So I'll just check in with my colleagues briefly. Did we get any other questions about some of those MPO items?
No, we haven't received any questions yet. And again, anyone can feel free to chat us or raise your hand and we can call on you.
And as Kate mentioned, we'll be sending some follow-up messages where you can get more information through either links or documents we may attach that expand on some of the things that we mentioned. And of course, as some of these items get released, for example, surveys that we're doing to support the TIP criteria, we can forward those to that distribution list as well. But if there are no other questions now, we can move ahead into that transit provider exchange. Folks can indicate if they want to make any updates or share information by putting things in the chat or by raising your hands if you'd like to do that. We can also take some of the remaining questions we had from the MBTA discussion. And Kate and Sandy, if you could help me come back to some of those, that would be great.
I can jump in with another question. One question, if Kat and Laurel still on the line, just out of curiosity, we had someone ask, why are some of the Blue Ridership higher than the other rail lines? And what other patterns does the data show? And we also got some questions on, is crowding data downloadable? Like if they're able to kind of go back and analyze.
Sure. I think that the reason why the blue line is much higher than the other rail lines is partially due to geography, right? Crossing the harbor creates like a bottleneck that makes it hard to bike and walk as alternatives. And it's also one of our lines that has the lowest, or sort of has the highest ridership of low income and communities of color to connect East Boston to Boston. So that's sort of the assumption that we're working on. The gates data for the subway gates is available for download through our data blog. which is linked to from the MBTA Back on Track website. We are currently working on updating the bus ridership data to share that as well. So hopefully that'll be available this week.
This kind of ties into some others. It sounds that these variable bus and possibly commuter rail schedules are going to be a way of life for the foreseeable future. You talked a little bit already, but what are some performance metrics you'll be using to know if your decisions were successful?
So it's hard. A lot of the ways we evaluate things are changing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like we said, based on ridership, but now ridership is not inherently a good thing either.
Right. So, and also like traditionally in a pilot, we would do surveys of passengers to figure out, what they were doing before, why they changed, if they changed. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we can sort of do those types of surveys that are not having survey takers out, in the field talking to people. So that's another challenge that we're working through as well. I think that, to see, because fundamentally we want to see like, are people switching from bus subway? So we could see increased ridership, say at the commuter rail lot station in Lynn, but we don't know if they were previously bus riders. And we could see maybe a decrease in crowding, and we could say like, oh, maybe these are connected, but we don't know for sure. So I think we're trying to bring in the parking data. But another interesting thing is that we think we're seeing a difference in parking behavior as well. That people are doing more drop-offs to our commuter rail lots and less parking. So that also has changed. So we can't sort of use that as a baseline either.
And the one thing I would add is at the very basic level so I think Laura's saying very much, and a lot of the fare work is sort of decisions and pilots we've made across mode and with fares. I think more tactically and operationally, we do look at crowding data on a day-to-day basis. We have a pretty basic report that literally goes to our bus operations and our general manager every single day about where do we have crowding, what is it looking like, and it helps drive decisions on the following day, where we have capacity, where we have workforce ability. But I think we use that partially to judge how well we did. And I think a great example of one thing for us to look at is the Route 111. So the Route 111, I'm going to get these numbers a little wrong, so I wouldn't directly hold me to these. That pre-COVID, the Route 111 had about, I want to say 373 trips a day. During the beginning of March, when we first responded to COVID, on a typical Saturday, they'll have 300 trips a day. Currently, right now, with the summer schedule, with some of the resources we were able to, when we were sort of rebalancing, we actually now have over 440 trips on the 111 today, right? So 70 more trips than we would even have pre-COVID. So that's one area where we'd look at 111 crowding and say, we made some pretty big decisions, and the service planning and scheduling did a lot of work to figure out how many trips can we put onto the 111 to help decrease crowding, because that's been a route where we've seen very durable ridership. And I think we have seen crowding decrease, but that's to Laurel's point too, is as ridership comes back, it's going to get difficult for us to disentangle what is crowding and what is a return on ridership, and eventually the metrics and the data will get very challenging, but we will do our best to monitor and continue to make data-driven decisions.
So one quick question we got was around coordination with public health experts. Could you describe, you talked about how public health has become such a much more part of how you plan service. What are some of the ways that you've coordinated with experts, and in what ways does that, or how do you facilitate those conversations?
So this is, I think, going to the first thing I said at the beginning, is like Laurel and I are just two people in the organization. And we are actually only speaking for, I think, one portion of the MBTA's COVID-19 response. Yeah. And so it's worthwhile to say that I'm going to have roughly 5 or 6 different working groups all working on different COVID issues. So one related to our ensuring we have enough PPE and PPE distribution. One entire working group focused on the cleaning and decontamination of vehicles and stations. An entire group that's led by Sam Silverberg and our Chief Administrative Officer on what are the right workforce policies we need in place. Laurel is leading the group on our broader transition planning. And then those all roll up into partly our security department, who then has representation on some of our the statewide organizations and groups. So we actually have an entire apparatus and organization and sort of processes that have come up in our org structure that's working in COVID-19. It is sort of led by our security department that is directly tied into the state's response. And that's predominantly some of our main ways of communication on sort of the state decisions, our state public health agencies, who then of course are obviously tied to the federal level. So it's, like I said, I think really just representing two groups, but there's a much larger group of organization that's tied to those conversations, depending on what the specific issue is at hand.
So one question we got was, speaking of dedicated bus lanes, does the T have a list of places where they've identified that they ideally would like bus lanes and even transit signal priority?
Yes. So bus lanes are actually a fascinating and really interesting conversation right now. I mean, bus lanes are always interesting conversations. We could talk for bus lanes for hours, as many of this call will know. I think there's a really interesting conversation about how has COVID-19 changed our approach to bus lanes. And so in previous presentations we've given both to the public and to our board on bus lanes, I think we've actually shared, and we actually worked with CTPS on this, right? On a variety of studies of where have we seen congestion, where there been a passage delay, and then using that to prioritize where do we want to build bus lanes. And last February, we actually prioritized, I want to say around 14 miles of, we said, high priority corridor based on, at that point, our highest ridership and the most passenger delay. And Wes Edwards and our transit priority team we're working through the process of coordinating with municipalities and other roadway owners to actually build and fund those. With COVID-19, actually, we've gone through a pretty rapid reprioritization in the past 2 months to say, of all of those lanes, we still think those are important lanes, but do we actually want to reprioritize and reprogram our bus priority sort of plan for the next 2 years based on that durable ridership? And so we have not yet published sort of what that reprioritization works like, because we're actively working with municipal partners to figure out how does this all work and how do we sort of all shift our priorities. But there's a lot of conversations going on actively right now. So there was a meeting on a outbound North Washington bus lane, I think just last week. There's one on Columbus Avenue today at 6 p.m. and there's one on Columbus Avenue at noon today, which is the first time we'd have center running bus lane in the Boston area. And that's one that we're really excited about and really passionate about too, because it covers some of our durable ridership routes like the 22. So I would say if people are curious like what we were thinking, I'd say start with sort of our plan from last year and that we're still going through the reprioritization process, say, are these still the right priorities in the world of COVID-19? And do we want to sort of, we still want to build all 14 miles plus of bus lane, but the order in which we build them will probably be shifted based on where we're seeing durable ridership and also question of quick implementation, right? It's faster to implement side running than center running. So we're going through that process right now. And a big thank to all of our municipal partners who are working with us side by side on this. But tonight, Columbus Ave, there's I believe BTD is hosting an online digital meeting for people who want to learn more about that. It's a very exciting project. I see Matt Moran there too, so from BTD.
I want to take a quick break to come back to the question that Kat and Laurel had raised for some of the providers, which was, I'm just calling it up in my screen here right now. Sorry about the delay. To give opportunities for some of the transit authorities and other folks in the room to respond to, and speak to some of their experiences responding to, the changes in circumstances and how they're handling the safety of their employees and customers. And at this point, folks are welcome to continue to submit things to the chat, but if it's faster, also feel free to raise your hand and MPO staff will call on you. You can use the raise hand functions, which you can click on by opening up the participants window, and you can find the raise hand controls down at the bottom of the screen. So Matt Archer, if you see any raised hands, please feel free to call on anyone speaking. Otherwise, we can pick up on things that may be coming through the chat.
Seeing none as of right now, we do have one from Susan Barrett. Susan?
Oh, hi, yeah, you can hear me. So you just wanted an update from us. So we oversee Lexpress. This is a town of Lexington. It's a public bus service. It's been operating for 40 years, serving primarily Lexington into Burlington, and it's been somewhat into Arlington. So we, prior to COVID, were planning changes based off of, you know, a few years of a study that had been going on, current survey, past survey, so forth. That timeline was obviously upended and got a little postponed. We did just have a survey, a virtual public forum July 7th that actually went well. We've so far received some pretty positive feedback. It's a pretty major change that we're proposing. That the service always used to have one-way loops, and now we're doing more of an out and back style, kind of hitting kind of key destinations, you know, eliminating kind of the least popular routes. It's heavily focused on, you know, our key populations, which tend to be, you know, seniors, lower income people, say working in markets and so forth, in our youth. And so Lexpress has been on hiatus at the moment due to some contract issues, but we look forward to being back. And when we do come back, it'll be with this new service. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Susan. Not seeing any other questions at the moment, but folks, feel free to raise your hand if you have anything to say.
And if there aren't further comments at this time, we can always take more questions from earlier. Just taking a look to see what items we may have remaining. We did have a question just about how the MBTA may leverage data that they're looking at now to maybe play for or plan for longer term changes in ridership that may be coming 1, 2, or 5 years down the line. So any insights you can share about that would be great.
I think that is a good question for how we're thinking about how COVID is impacting the thinking in our bus network redesign, because that's sort of where we're thinking about kind of what the network should look like in the next few years. And so that team is definitely looking at our current ridership data, but also interestingly looking at current travel data across the region that's not just transit, to see sort of, are we seeing any kind of shifts overall in the transportation patterns in the region that we should be sort of taking into account. So trying to use both sources of data to sort of really understand how this has impacted ridership as well as travel patterns.
Michelle, actually, so I like to occasionally take the liberty to reinforce what I hear you saying, which is I think that is one of the very important areas for collaboration across all agencies, is that need to sort of share and think critically about data and information and sort of tie it together in a way that makes sense. I really enjoyed, Laurel, the point you were making earlier about the fact that, actually, I think, sorry, it was probably both of you, about the fact that we can't use data the same way that we have in the past. And so, you know, data is incredibly valuable, but it's not everything. And that there are a lot of policy decisions that have to be made now and in the future, despite, you know, what our other resources may not be telling us or may be telling us. So I think that's a really excellent sort of point about our need to all work closely together to try to think about those cross-cutting sort of uses of data and information at hand.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I think that that's one place where Kat mentioned this at the beginning, where like we sort of were supplementing the like where we saw crowding in the data with sort of the customer feedback we were getting and feedback from community groups, knowing that some things don't show up in our data, right? That we also need that community feedback as well, and how to bring those two things together. And so I think one of the other things we've been doing throughout this whole period is still surveying our customers through our panel survey, to get at so our frequent riders before who might not be riding it now, what they're doing now, to also try to understand how the behavior changes, people who aren't riding, and what they're doing instead, because that will also inform kind of our thinking around the future as well. So we've been thinking, I guess, both, yeah, quantitatively and qualitatively, how we can continue to gather data in this time.
Yeah.
So we did receive a question. Is there anything in place for safe travels when school or college or daycare centers start opening? And there's a related element of travel instruction has been going on virtually, and wondering how, it makes sense to start up offering that, component again. And so if the T has anything to share about, how it's been working with travel and instruction that they maybe haven't gotten to already, that information would be helpful.
I'm not sure I understand the second part of the question, but the first part of the question, I think, is one of the big pieces of uncertainty that we don't totally have answered yet. And so what schools are doing, and both colleges and universities starting to come out with K through 12 is actually a huge piece of our fall schedules. And so it's a place where, any insight anyone else has into the school district plans in their community would be useful.
Yep, so we're at the point too where we've had to make a number of estimated guesses about what some of the scenarios are, and I think we're all just gonna have to, and I imagine many of you are in the same situation, we're just all gonna have to deal with the best of it as possible, which is probably true of most of 2020.
I think I'll just jump in to clarify the second part of the question, which I think was saying, the MBTA has a travel training program, and is that travel training program, what is it doing currently, and is it going to develop or evolve in some ways to reflect the changed reality, and to train on the specific aspects of travel during the COVID emergency? And I realize that you guys may not be the right people to answer that question. But
yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I don't think we're the right people to answer it, but it's a good point.
Yeah, we can take that back and try to bring it back to you guys.
Okay, well, I just want to give transit providers a last chance to raise any questions or share experiences. Otherwise, we can move on to that general public comment element of the discussion and pick up any remaining pieces in that section. So I'm not seeing any additional raised hands. So maybe we can move on to the public comment, which is kind of a broader exchange item for folks from the public or advocates or others who may not be providing transit service but are involved in the transit space who want to raise comments or issues. I believe we have a couple of items that we received in the chat a little bit earlier. If one of my colleagues could capture those, and maybe we could give just briefly, or we can give folks the opportunity to relay those comments directly. I know we've heard from Lisa Weber and John Seward. So John Stewart had mentioned that rather than unwinding, which is a legitimate concern, proactive policies and actions should be continually monitored and reviewed for efficacy. Some policies may not be needed or needed in lesser intensity, and some actions or protocols may be needed to maximize safety. And I just want to give John an opportunity to elaborate. If you'd like to do that, please raise your hand. And he may have jumped off the call a little earlier. Coming back, Lisa Weber, who I'll see if she is still available, had submitted some comments.
Lisa is here.
Okay, great. Yeah, Lisa, maybe it would help if you could raise your hand and maybe make some comment directly. That would be great. If Matt, you could unmute her, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
Hey everybody, thank you all so much for doing this. So you got my second question, which was about what performance metrics are going to be used. The first comment was about how the general public looks at pieces of information versus the way us enthusiasts looks at pieces of information. So a member of the public might look at a schedule change as a trip that they showed up to that day that didn't happen, and look at it the exact same way as let's say a ghosted trip where a bus was pulled off of that route to go to a different route. They don't know all of the wonderful things that I do for fun, that I think you guys do for fun, to look at all of the reasonings why. They just know that they thought a trip was happening, it didn't happen, and now they're having a really hard time trusting it again. And I'm just hearing that word trust in so many of my communities. That's where I was so concerned with the approach of the continuous modifications, because as soon as somebody says, uh-oh, I lost my job, all right, here's this other employment center, but I don't know if my bus is going to get me there. I don't know if I can take it. And we're coming into September where people are signing leases and things like that. So that's where my biggest concern came from, the approach of being reactive as opposed to saying, here's how we're going to put all this information together. Here's how we're going to make really good decisions that we think are going to meet people's needs. So that was just my biggest concern, was it's like a chicken egg thing. It's how is somebody going to trust a route that might not be there when the reason it's not there anymore is because there was such a strong need somewhere else. So that's where I was coming from on that. But these, I love going to these. I'm so glad we're having them on Zoom so I can go to them now. And thank you all for being here and for all the work you do.
Thanks, Lisa. And I just wanted to address really quickly, like John Stewart got back in the chat and said he's having some challenges with raising his hand, but just wanted to tie on to his prior comment about a question around liaising with contact tracing efforts. And just a question to transportation providers in general to alert employers and the public about current lowest uncrowded conditions and to assist in trip planning and establishing flex time work schedules. That's quite a couple of things in one comment. But I think the first part is addressing any contact tracing along with transit service. It might just be more of a comment out to the broader group.
I can't comment on our contact tracing. I know, again, similar to, we often look to DPS, Department of Public Health, to contact us, and they'll often ask us questions. So we usually go by their lead.
And then just one more quick question is, you know, in any of these changes in modes, going to try or consider use of electric modes or less polluting forms of transportation in bus routes?
So in terms of, I think it's always, we think about less polluting, right? Moving from a vehicle to a bus, we always think is inherently sort of net positive good, net reduction in pollution. Electric vehicles, it was a significant both vehicle investment and facility investment, and we currently do not have neither the fleet nor the facility infrastructure yet to support electric vehicles. Nor do I think we believe the technology, I believe, is quite where it needs to be yet. So there's a whole team. Then I think there's a much broader electrification conversation at the MBTA, both for our bus fleet as well as other modes. That at least is the MBTA answer. And it's also, vehicle procurements are at least I want to say at least 2 years plus. I'm going to get the time exactly wrong, so it's probably nothing that can be redone in this fall, but it's part of the longer term strategy for the MBTA.
Okay, we're just want to check and see if we've gotten in anything else through the chat. We're all coming up on the close of the meeting, so we'll check and see if we've got any remaining items, and then I'll just remind folks of how we plan to follow up. So if we don't have anything remaining, or if Kat and Laurel, there aren't any other remarks you'd like to make, I'll move into the closeout.
I'll just say really quick that we got lots of chats thanking for the presenters for talking today. So I just want to reiterate their thanks and make sure you heard it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to us.
So this has been great, and I think it's your coming here has been a really valuable experience for this pilot transit working group as we learn more about how to connect providers in the region. And so we really appreciate your support at doing that at this meeting today. So just to close out, as I mentioned, we'll be sending up some follow-up materials, including some notes about some of the themes that were captured today and bringing in some of the resources that we mentioned in various parts of the discussion, both during the MBTA portion as well as the material related to MPO activities. So keep an eye out for some follow-up messages. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, the recording of this event will be available on the Boston Region MPO's YouTube page, which covers, our various events, of which this is one of them. And we'll be looking, as Hagen mentioned, at the very beginning of the meeting to move this particular pilot transit working group onto a more consistent meeting schedule after this kind of long hiatus. So we'll be looking to do meetings more on a quarterly basis, and we'll be reaching out to folks once we have a sense of when we'd be able to reconvene the group. So I would like to thank everybody for being able to be here today and to participate. And with that, I think we can close out the meeting. Oh, Matt, did you have
I'm sorry,
something?
we do have someone with a raised hand here.
Okay, sure.
Rhoda Gibson, if you think we have time.
Sure, it's about 4:27. We got a couple minutes left, so sure, go ahead.
All right, thank you.
Hi, this is Rhoda Gibson from Mass Adapt. I just, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just sent a chat, put it in the chat. Will you be able to send us an email with all the links that was in the chat room? Because I was unable to get them all and copy them all before we close out.
Absolutely. We can get the material from the chat and share those links with the folks on the call today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. I hope you have a great afternoon.